When attempting to gain power, inconvenient truths are often ignored by those in charge of crafting the narrative. One such narrative we see today is the idea that the Crusades are a dark blotch on the history of Christ's church. These Crusades are depicted as being a time when Christians wrongly pillaged non believing communities and forced individuals to convert or die at the hand of the sword. However, myself and many others like me have often wondered what inconvenient truths are being ignored in order to craft this narrative of evil Christians neglecting Christ's teachings and killing innocents. On this episode of Forge and Anvil, I will be joined by author Raymond Ibrahim to ask the question, were the Crusades really as bad as we've been told? All this and more, so stick around. Welcome to Forge and Anvil, everyone, where we hammer out uncomfortable conversations to sharpen ourselves for the cultural, political, and spiritual war we are living in. My name is Connor. I am host of this podcast. I am a husband, a father, and a follower of Christ Jesus, just doing my best to represent him well wherever I can. And as I mentioned in the cold open, I am joined by author Raymond Ibrahim. So Raymond, go ahead and say hello to the audience and introduce yourself to those who are not yet familiar with your work.
Sure, Connor. Greetings, everyone. Good to be with you all. My work basically these days focuses more on what I actually used to focus on academically, which is history, specifically the history of Islamic-Christian interaction, conflict, warfare, etc. That's really what I studied well over 20 years ago in college. A lot of people like to or are happy to hear my professor at the time was Victor Davis Hanson, military classicist and kind of a big shot nowadays. I can't seem to turn the TV on without seeing him. But back in those days, he was a lot less known, but just as brilliant, obviously. And so it was good to have him as a professor back then, and I'm still in touch with him because I really learned a lot about military history, and that was the field I was focused in, like I said, military history of Islam vis-a-vis the West. So the last books I've written, the newer one, Defenders of the West, the Christian Heroes who stood up against Islam, which came out in 2022. And the one before it, Sword and Scimitar, 14 Centuries of War Between Islam and West, that came out in 2018. And as you can tell from the titles, they both really look at the history of conflict and warfare between Christian Europe and the Islamic world. And they very much address the question that you posed at the beginning about the Crusades and so forth. So we'll definitely have a lot of fun to talk about that. And other than that, I've just really been academically and professionally. And my background, my family's from Egypt. I was born here. If you're familiar with the term Coptic Christians, the indigenous Christians of Egypt who didn't become Muslim after 14 centuries. And are still being persecuted there. Mm-hmm. So I grew up here kind of with an interest in that topic, obviously. And I also grew up bilingual. And I also formally studied Arabic in college as well. And really my early work in the beginning, I was at the Library of Congress, was dealing with things like Al-Qaeda and radical Islam and translating some of their work and ideas and analyzing, et cetera, et cetera. But now, like I said, I'm dealing with history, and so I think we'll have a good conversation.
Yeah, and we're glad to have you and have your expertise. So really appreciate you being here. Before we get started, for those of you listening back to this podcast or watching it live, be sure to head over to our Substack. That's forgeandanvil.substack.com. That is home for everything Forge and Anvil. We have extra content for those of you who want to become paid members, or if you just want to sign up for free, we'll be sending you updates of the show to your email, as well as written articles by yours truly. So I'd appreciate it if you went ahead and hopped over to forgeandanvil.substack.com. Of course, like and share this video, hit the subscribe button, repost this if you're watching it over on X. Really appreciate it. It does help us with the algorithm. But that's all the laundry for now. So we'll go ahead and get straight into it. So yeah, Raymond, like I said, I'm really hoping to dispel a lot of myths. The Crusades is something that I've only taken a recent interest in. Part of that's just because I'm admittingly very ignorant on the topic. And I was really tempted to pick up your book and read it prior to this conversation to become super knowledgeable and really take a deep dive on the material that you've already written. But I've also learned over the course of doing this podcast that some of my best interviews have been the times when I'm approaching a subject as a complete newbie, because I feel as though I ask the questions that a lot of the audience is going to want to know. So let's just go ahead and start with the Crusades and maybe start kind of from the beginning. So obviously you're a student of history, and although I'm no historian by any means, I do know that history, you always have to pick a starting point if you're going to try to tell a history, and sometimes that can be hard. So where would you place the beginning of the Crusade era? And then we could talk maybe a little bit more about how the Crusades actually started.
Sure. Well, if your typical historian will tell you the Crusades are basically from 1095 to 1291. So 1095 being when Pope Urban II calls for the First Crusade, Council of Clermont. And 1291 is basically the Crusaders lose their final foothold in the Holy Lands with the conquest of Acre or Acre. Some people pronounce it still, but and I think here's where the problem really does begin, because your question fundamentally is where I heard you in the beginning talking about these Crusaders, where they just out betraying the teachings of Christ and forcing people to convert and slaughtering and just essentially being evil. And I think the problem with it is if we do follow that time frame, which is what people do, because when you do that, if you start right away with the First Crusade, you are beginning it in a vacuum. And that is what happens. And so you don't understand the backdrop, the context of why the Crusaders did what they did and why they were so violent and ferocious at times. So I'll give you a quick back. So I think it's best to start off with the context, okay? Because to me, and here's the other issue, the Crusades, again, if you talk about Christian-Muslim warfare historically, the first thing anyone will tell you, and the last thing, will be the Crusades. That's all they know. But honestly, the Crusades are a drop in the bucket of the totality of violent warfare between Muslims and Christians. And so you can already see that it's being pinpointed, it's being pulled out of context, because, and I'll get into that, because the Christians appear to the aggressor, because they're the ones who are traveling to Islamic lands.
Right.
Excuse me. But if you start 4 centuries earlier, so it really all begins with Islam. Islam comes in the 7th century. The traditional dates, Muhammad dies in 632 AD. Excuse me. All right. And then with Muhammad's death, you have the consolidation of Arabia, basically under Islam, thanks to the first caliph, his father-in-law, Abu Bakr. And then really right around 634, you get what is called the massive jihad, or historically they're known as the Great Arab Conquests. And essentially like dominoes. So Muhammad died in 632. By 732, Islam is now in the middle of France. Okay, it had conquered all of North Africa, all of the Middle East, Southwest Asia. To give them their modern names, basically all of the Middle East: Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Israel, Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, Spain conquered in 711. And then in 732, most of Southwest France is awash with jihadist terror. And finally in 732, you get the Battle of Tours, which, it does stop them there, but they're still awash all throughout the Mediterranean islands get conquered, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the important thing to keep in mind is if you talk to your average person today and you mention Egypt or Syria, people just have it in the back of their head that these nations were like always Islamic, and maybe before that, I don't know, maybe they were Pharaonic or something. Actually, if you go in the 7th century, that was the heart of the Christian world. It wasn't really Europe. You had 5 major ecclesiastical centers. One was Rome, and that was the one that survived in the West. And the other 4 major ones were in the East. And the biggest really was Alexandria. You had Jerusalem, you had Antioch, and then later you get Constantinople. Well, 3 of those immediately got swallowed up in that 1st century: Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. And later on, Constantinople, of course, also gets conquered under Islam. But the point I'm trying to make is, if you really look at a map, and I've done that even in one of my books, I show a map, and you look at the Christendom, essentially, or the Christian world at the dawn of Islam, it's a huge block. It's all of, or most of Europe, southwest of the Danube and the Rhine, okay, but all of North Africa and all of the Middle East, okay, and that is really that's the more really progressive side, it's hard for people to get this now when you think of those regions and how they are today. And it's in the subconscious, Europe is more progressive, but actually, no, Africa was more progressive. That's why the Roman Emperor Constantine moved the capital from Rome to the east, into Turkey, modern day Turkey, into Byzantium, little town. So the point I'm trying to make is that Islam had a massive cataclysmic impact on the Christian world, and it swallowed up and conquered and ultimately Islamized 75% of what was once original Christian territory. Okay, and this, like I said, again, Egypt. If you go to all these early councils, all the early church theologians and fathers are all Middle Easterners. To be honest with you, they're Egyptians and they're Syrians. A lot of times because they're Greek speaking. This is the Hellenistic era. Everyone was Greek speaking then, but a lot of them are actually ethnic Middle Eastern people. Augustine, the father of Western Christianity, is a North African. He was a Berber, essentially. So we forget that area was really vibrant and really the larger and more influential part of the Christian world, and it was violently wrested through Islamic conquest in just one century. And then that continued on, these raids, they continued on all the time. Europe was essentially at this point, now Europe became the only Christian stronghold, now that North Africa and the Middle East were severed, and Islam was completely surrounded from every angle. Europe, including in Spain, on the continent itself. And it really became kind of like a bastion of Christianity, and it kept getting attacked still. And so, the fall of Constantinople, I mentioned, that happens in 1453. Rome itself was not immune, and I believe in 846, I want to say, sometime in the 9th century, it was sacked by Muslims from North Africa. And so you had this ongoing massive attack that was traumatic to the development of the Christian West. Okay. And right before now, so let's fast forward to the First Crusade, 1095. Right before that, you had another iteration of Islamic jihad, terrorism, and conquest that was ongoing, and this was now under the Seljuk Turks. So, as you know, historically the Arabs are the founders of Islam, but throughout history, the caliphates and the sultanates changed to different groups and different peoples, and then at this point, really the Turks. And later on, you get the Mongols, who become called Tatars, and you also had the Berbers in North Africa, who were also Muslim and had their own, limelight, if you will. But the point is, right before the First Crusade, under the Seljuk Turks, you had massacres, atrocities. And to go back again in time, just under one caliph in Egypt, the Caliph Amr, his name, he's a Fatimid Caliph, Amr, I'm forgetting his name. Hakim Ba'amr Allah, under his rule, he had 30,000 churches actually destroyed or turned into mosques in Egypt and Greater Syria. And so that again underscores just how Christian that area was. But the things that, we're told about ISIS, if you recall, the Islamic State, all the atrocities that they committed, whether it's burning churches, destroying them, crucifying people, beheading them, enslaving women and children, it was that for centuries against the Christian West. All right. And that's what was happening. So right before the First Crusade, the Seljuks in Armenia, for example, about 20 years before the First Crusade, were running amok. They were burning down, the cities. The city of Ani, which was the capital of Armenia, known as the city of 1,001 churches, was completely torched, every last church. Tens of thousands of Armenian Christians and also Greeks from the western part of Anatolia, either slaughtered or enslaved, and we have copious records of it. I mean, one Arab record actually says that after the devastation, I tried to walk in this one Armenian city. I couldn't because of all the corpses and the bodies. And that was just par for the course during that time. And also, Western pilgrims or European pilgrims who would go to the Holy Land around this time were also being molested in horrific ways. And we have records of it, what they would do to these pilgrims, etc. So that is the background of the First Crusade. And usually people don't know any of this, and they just think it was fine. Muslims lived in their area and Christians were in Europe. And all of a sudden, I even know there's a professor, John Esposito, he wrote a book. He went professor at Georgetown, where I actually went for a time. And in one of his books, he writes, I'm paraphrasing, but almost verbatim, he writes something like 4 centuries of peace elapsed between the Muslim and Christian worlds until papal power play came into effect, and basically all these evil Christian Catholics went trying to colonize the peaceful Middle East, and since then it's left a legacy of distrust and animosity. Okay, so that's how it's presented, unfortunately,
Right.
in that vacuum. Whereas what I just told you is really what happened.
Right. Yeah, and it's very true. And I'm a product of public education, and I think most individuals in America today. I mean, even homeschoolers. In fact, I was speaking with my wife not long ago and talking to her about how I'm going to be having you on to talk about the Crusades, and she said, "Oh, the Crusades were awful." I was like, well, that's what we've all been told, and that context. I only recently learned some of what you've just laid out for us there, and it's like when you understand the context of there were centuries of Christian lands being attacked and their citizens being brutally murdered and their women being raped and the beheadings and the burning of their communities, you start to understand, okay, so the Crusades was a bit of a response. So, what was the initial intent of the first crusade? Was it to reconquer stolen land? Was it revenge? How would you describe that?
No, it was actually the way it was articulated was through the biblical verse where Jesus says, love God with all your heart and then love your fellow man. And that's
Mhm.
how they saw it. So loving God in that time, the Holy Land was so important. This is where Jesus walked. This is where he
Yeah.
died and was resurrected, etc. We can't just be left in pagan hands, as they described it, who were destroying churches and committing sacrilege. And the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which was very important, of course, at the time was repeatedly being attacked. The one caliph I told you who had 30,000 churches destroyed, he actually had the Church of the Holy Sepulchre completely razed to the ground and was rebuilt again. So on the one hand, it was for God's honor and for love of God to protect and to cleanse the Holy Land, and for love of the fellow man who's being persecuted, fellow Christians who were, whether it was these Eastern Christians or the pilgrims who were also going there. So that was the stated understanding and goal. It wasn't revenge, although they were aware, of course, of what was going of the history that I told you, at least in a loose and general sense, and definitely the more literate among them, the clergy class, of course, understood all this because you see it in the sources, and I quote it oftentimes where they mention, for example, Egypt was this beacon of Christianity. Now it's under the yoke of the Saracen, et cetera, et cetera. So that was it was an altruistic gesture, believe it or not, and
Mm.
think of how evil it's presented today, and what these people went through. A lot of them, the First Crusade and all the Crusades, but I'm just focusing on the first right now. These were all rich people. For a while, there was this theory that the only people who went on a crusade were so-called second sons who had nothing to live for because they really have no inheritance, and they just went there to colonize the Middle
Mm.
East and try to create a principality for themselves. Well, the reality is a lot of these guys actually were very rich, were first sons, and owned immense properties and were wealthy and had a lot to lose, and they still went there. Someone like even King Richard in the Third Crusade, about a century later, it was the same thing. He's a king, and you also had emperors, the Holy Roman emperors, and kings of France would go. So it was definitely a sincere conviction that they were doing the right thing to both honor God and to protect and show their love for fellow Christians.
Mm. Yeah, and then of course, obviously, the Crusades then kick off with these intentions in mind. So, I mean, let's talk about how bad the actual actions of the Crusaders were. I mean, is this something where we see the Crusaders showed a lot of restraint in their actions, or is this something where the critics actually have something to talk about because then the Crusaders just doubled down and two wrongs made a right in their eyes. They started doing the exact same pillaging and burning and beheading. What did that look like?
Right. Well, okay, because the Crusaders are first and foremost fallible humans, of course you had what would, by today's standards, pass for atrocities and ignoble behavior, et cetera, et cetera. Though it's not as bad as people make it sound. What we have today is this. I'll give you a perfect example. They find one thing, okay. So, for example, one of the famous things of the First Crusade is the peasant or the People's Crusade, which really went out before the professional crusaders. It was just enthusiastic peasants. They would attack, for example, Jews and in Europe, And their logic was, why am I traveling this far to fight that infidel when I have an infidel here, et cetera, et cetera. So that was the logic. Okay. But what you're not told is oftentimes the church itself would condemn that kind of action, would try to protect the Jews, and a lot of the knightly classes as well, the professional crusaders, felt the same way. Okay, so that's what I mean. You did get some ugly stuff, but you're often not told of the sort of the counter. And what you're definitely not told, and now this is really where it's pulled out of context, is especially when Islam comes into play. So now let's leave Europe. Most of the atrocities that people will point at, I'll give you an example. One of the biggest one that you'll always hear is King Richard. I mentioned it. After the seizure of Acre, it was taken by Muslims, and then Christians under Richard reclaimed it, and he had about something like 2,000 or 3,000 Turkish garrison hostages, and he parlayed with Saladin at the time, and Saladin agreed he would ransom them with a certain amount of money, and then when the date came, Saladin didn't pay. And again, he was told, this is their life we're talking about. You either ransom them or they die. Again, Saladin didn't do it. So Richard had them all executed in front of Saladin, who was afar on a mountaintop. And I've seen it in movies, I've seen it in books. It's always underscored as, the terrible, like how evil the Crusaders were. Okay, but it doesn't overlook a couple of things, or it overlooks a couple of things. First, that was the way warfare was. If you have hostages and you make a deal and you negotiate a deal and that person fails, the hostage's life is forfeit. That's just the way it was with Europeans and Muslims. In fact, Saladin himself, after this happened, had something like 2,000 Christians beheaded. We don't hear about that part. Moreover, you never hear about the fact that when Muslims would attack and invade Christian territories, slaughter, aside from the enslavement, just slaughtering people left and right was just common. And one example, and I have it in one of my books, Sword and Scimitar, a caliph, this is before the Crusades, he invaded Byzantine or Eastern Roman territory in Asia Minor. I believe it's called Amorium, sometime in the 9th century. And it had something like 70,000 people. And he completely devastated it with his soldiers. He had slave soldiers, Muslim slave soldiers. And he completely devastated it and enslaved so many, but there was such a surplus of humanity, he didn't know what to do with that. When he came across 4,000 Christian men and he had no use for them, he ordered them executed on the spot. Okay, so my point is this: have you heard of that? Probably not.
No.
Not many people do. And there's a lot of stories like that Muslims did. And so what they do is they ignore all that. Okay, then they find the one thing that Richard did and pull it out of context, put the spotlight on it and pretend that nothing like that ever happened at the hands of Muslims, when in fact a lot worse happened at the hands of Muslims. Like the one example I gave you, I mean, these were innocent 4,000 people. He just had them killed because he didn't know what to do with them. At least with Richard, there was a deal made, and he had to keep going. And the other reason he had to kill him is because he had to leave Acre and continue his march. And he didn't want to leave 2,000-3,000 Turks there. He didn't have enough manpower to guard them. So the logic was there, and nobody at the time, Muslim or Christian, was shocked by this, is my point. But again, here today, they take it out, they pull it out, they put a spotlight on it, and they act like, wow, no one's ever done this before. In fact, they have. Another example is the culmination of the First Crusade, when the Holy City, Jerusalem, finally gets conquered by the Crusaders in 1099. According to the Christian sources, who some historians say they kind of exaggerated to give it an apocalyptic veneer, but they just completely massacred all the Jews and the Muslims and the Christians, supposedly, once they got into Jerusalem, because they were in a mad frenzy. And if you read why they were in a mad frenzy, it makes sense, because they had gone through years of starvation and plague and thirst, and finally they got in. Okay, but be that as it may, it is a great atrocity, let us say, et cetera, et cetera. And you probably have heard it, but you haven't heard of all the times that Muslims did much worse. So, for example, I was reading Thomas Madden. He's a well-known historian, and he writes the single worst atrocity committed in the entire crusading era was, of course, when the Muslims conquered Antioch. I think sometime around 1270 something. And I quoted in the book what the Muslims said and did, and they literally locked the doors and the gates and had a complete orgiastic bloodbath of everyone. Just horrific. And even the Sultan himself sent a letter boasting about how the things we did to your holy books, the things we did to your women and children, and we defiled your altar, and et cetera, et cetera. So did bad things happen during the Crusades? Yes, but the point is, just as bad, if not worse, happened at the hands of the Muslims. And so really, in my eyes, it all kind of cancels out. It's warfare, and people are doing extreme things. But if you really want to look at it, the Muslim side did a lot worse, and we just don't hear about it. You just hear what the Christians did. And if you just, again, get it in a vacuum without knowing the backdrop, yeah, it seems like they were pretty savage.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's a lot of, my purpose behind this episode is because and maybe I should have laid this out at the beginning of the episode a little bit for my viewers, but the reality is I think we're all beginning to get familiar with the idea of revisionist history, especially in modern America when we see the founding fathers, just their names just dragged through the mud. We see, it started off with removal of Confederate statues, but now it's turned into George Washington because he was a white supremacist, yada yada, and luckily, there's a large portion of America that's realizing, oh, you're just tearing down all American history. We were willing to go with you on things like Confederate history, and then all of a sudden you started talking about just the founding fathers, and then you started just talking about everyday presidents, and it's no longer shocking to hear that someone has taken someone from history out of context, applied a modern lens to it, and then condemned the person. And for me, I believe that the Crusades is one of the few instances in history that people use all the time as a weapon against Christians for, oh, well, this is what your religious extremists look like. And they point to the Crusades, and they usually point to things like you've already mentioned, like instances like with Richard, with King Richard. And they point to that stuff out of context and say, see, you guys are just as bad. And I believe it was Obama, several years back when he was president, he basically made the same thing when he was talking about some of the extremists in the Middle East. He was kind of saying, well, we shouldn't judge though, because we have history in all religions of extremism. And he kind of pointed the Crusades to kind of basically get the church in America to shut up. And so for me, I don't want to give a hall pass to the atrocities that maybe were committed by the Crusaders, but I also don't want to take them completely out of context. I want to provide that context to my listeners because I think it's important in this cultural this cultural revolution that we're currently living in the midst of. It's important to actually know that history so that when someone tries to just come at you and say, well, you guys shouldn't be living out your faith in the public square, because when that happens, you guys will eventually get to the point where you're going to have another crusade, and it's going to be this bloodbath, just like the first one where you guys attacked innocents out of nowhere, just because you were religious zealots. And in reality is, when you provide all the context that you've given us, that's just not the case. It's just, the reality is, it's just ugly warfare on both sides is what it really comes down to. Am I right on that?
You're right on that. And I mean, I would also insist on pointing out it's ugly warfare on both sides, but overall, the Christians definitely show more restraint and more, if you will, mercy. They still reflect the teachings of Christ. Of course, it's warfare and there's, slaughter, but you have it because, you have the principles in the Sermon on the Mount that still resonates even with these Christians very much. So there's still, that manifests itself in one way or the other. So I would not argue that they're the same. I would still argue that the Muslims, I mean, fundamentally, keep in mind, the Muslims started this. They're the ones who invaded, conquered, and terrorized Christian territory. Okay, and in no way, shape, or form, in my mind, especially in the keeping with the concept of just war theory, are the Christians. I mean, they're completely exonerated at this point because your territory has been stolen. You have people there attacking your people, Christians, and you want to go and liberate it and help them. Okay, so yeah, now in the midst of that, you have what modern people may call atrocities, which is commonplace for the time and for all peoples. But I would, and by the way, just to get what Obama said, because that's etched in my mind.
I'm sure.
To remind you, he said he was, again, some Islamic terror attack had happened, one of the many countless that I can't remember, and it was a big one. It was in the news, and he said, but before we get on our high horses, let's not forget, that we've had our share of crusades and inquisitions, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. And the sad part is he's playing on the idea that what he said just assumes that everyone thinks that the Crusades are what he is saying that they are.
Right.
just terrible atrocity again, because that's how most people think. But I'll even go one step further and just show you how even the Inquisition, all right, and especially in the context of Spain, I'll just give you an example of how, when you hear the Inquisition, wow, is there anything worse that can come out of Christian medieval Europe, right? It's always that. Well, the Inquisition, when you really delve into the sources, okay, and it really starts in Spain. Well, isn't it interesting? Why does it start in Spain? Well, Spain's the one that had a lot of Muslims, right? Because you had the Reconquista going on, and I told you in the 8th century, Spain was conquered. And it was almost entirely, the entire peninsula was almost entirely conquered, except for a small quadrant in the northwest, which had all these hold-up Christians. And they started slowly, century after century after century, expanding downwards until by the late 1400s, under Ferdinand and Isabella, all the entire Muslim territory left was in the southern tip of Spain, Granada, and it had something like 500,000 Muslims. And finally, it was conquered, and the Spanish crown was lenient. It said to the Muslims, you can remain Muslim, you can keep your Sharia law in Granada, etc. Just pay taxes and follow our rules, essentially. And the problem is the Muslims continue trying to subvert, and we're allying with the Ottomans, and we're allying with North African Barbary pirates, trying to reposition Islam back into Spain the way it was. So finally, the crown basically said, you have two choices. We can't have this anymore. You can either leave and we'll give you passage to North Africa, or you have to convert to Christianity. Now, the idea of converting was not because now it's shown in movies, like we're crazy fanatical Christians and you have to be one of us or we'll kill you. That wasn't the logic. The logic was because back then atheism and secularism is not an option. You have to have a religion, obviously. Everyone believes in some God. So the logic was, as long as they're Muslim, they're going to hate us, and we're infidels, and they have to do what they're doing, trying to subvert, overthrow us, etc. But if they become Christians, then hopefully in a generation or two, this animosity will die away because they'll be one of us. That was the logic. Okay, so in Islam, there's something called taqiyya. It's a doctrine, and it basically says if you can lie, in this case, you can pretend to convert to Christianity. You can even partake of the communion. You can renounce Muhammad. Okay, you can do all this as a Muslim, as long as in your heart you're still a true Muslim and you're trying to help empower Islam. Then you can do all that, right? And a fatwa came out from North Africa saying precisely that. So that 500,000 population in Spain, the Muslims, all of them converted overnight. Okay, it was the Christians were naive. They just thought, wow, hallelujah, that's great. Okay. And then what happened is they continue, even though they would go to church, and for all intents and purposes, they were better Christians. You have records of Christians from the time of priests saying these people were better Christians than us. And for generation after generation, and already in the 1600s, their descendants were still in their heart Muslims, and they were still preaching jihad at home, and they were still engaged in machinations against subverting Spain, and working with outside Ottomans and other Muslims, etc., etc. And that's how the Inquisition came into being, because there were so many of these so-called converts, and the Spanish crown didn't know what to do with them, so they had to put them through this Inquisition to try to find out, are these actually real Christians, or are these Muslims who are pretending to be Christians and still in their mind are typical jihadists. And like I told you, we have records of clerics saying these people were better than us. They were punctual to church. They partook of the communion every week. They went to confession, and at home they were preaching hate, kill the infidel, etc., etc. So my point is, that's not, I'm sure, what you heard. You heard the Inquisition is just a typical example of fanatical medieval Christians who can't let poor Muslims live in peace, so they're forcing them to become just like them. And that's, again, not the case. So the bare bone facts are true. You did have something like that, but here's the context, and I'm sure the context makes it look a lot different.
Right. Yeah, and so I mean, obviously, this is a lot of there's a lot of revisionist history that paints it different. That's really to blame for the mass ignorance that we see in American Christians today. So, I mean, I'm sure there's quite a few that you can point to, but who are the biggest offenders of this revisionist history?
Well, I mean, it's very academic. I'll tell you, you were mentioning earlier about a lot of people are starting to connect the dots, and and it keeps growing and growing, right? George Washington's being attacked, everyone's being attacked,
Right.
but the Crusaders, they go way back, right? Unfortunately, one of the reasons for that has to do with the whole Catholic Protestant divide, because what happened is when the Protestants, with the Reformation came up, and both of them demonized each other, Catholics and Protestants demonized each other. It
Right.
was easy fodder for the Protestants to point to the Crusades and to pull them out of context into, look at these evil Christians. And it's during this era that the Saracen, the Muslim, starts looking enlightened, and he's sort of juxtaposed and presented as better than the Catholic. This is unfortunately one of the little known byproducts of the split between these two churches, which was a sort of rehabilitation of the Muslim and the demonizing of the Catholic. And in this case, so this is where you get, this is why the Crusades are what they are today. This is why the Inquisition is what it is today. But for objective historians, they know that's not the case. In fact, the Inquisition, going back to that, again, this is a recent find, apparently, based on the release of the archives of the Inquisition, was that it was actually a good thing. It was meant to stop people from getting killed, because the secular authority were killing. If you're a Christian and you become another religion, it was a secular authority that would kill you on you being a traitor. That was seen as switching your allegiance. So the Inquisition was the church's way of trying to intervene and say, well, let's just make sure they are before you kill them. So that's the newest find of the Inquisition. At any rate, the point is, because of this Catholic Protestant divide, the Crusaders from of old have already been so demonized and distorted, as an example of of why Catholics are so bad. And I'm not trying to, I'm not Catholic, I'm not Protestant, I'm not trying to get into this. I know this is one of those topics. I'm not trying to get into that. I'm just saying, theology aside, this was one of the unfortunate outcomes. It really divorced Western Protestants from their earlier history, and they made them see their early history as just a bad thing that they want nothing to do with. And so I think that's really the beginnings. And then it comes down to our time and age, where everyone knows of fake news, but really fake history has been going on for so long, and it's also agenda driven. A lot of these studies, you're asking me who's doing it. A lot of, I mentioned Georgetown University. They get billions from Muslim nations, like radical Muslim nations, Saudi Arabia, and a lot of the Ivy League schools. And that's where a lot of these history professors come from, and that's the stuff that they teach. It's so today, when I read a book, it's a modern day academic, and it's a historical book, it's either this person is just so drinking their own Kool-Aid, as it were, or they're just trying to lie so much. And it's so easy to do if you're an academic, because your average person doesn't know any better. He's looking to you to simplify history. That's what a secondary history is. But if you do what I did over decades now, 25 years, which is to consult the archives. I used to work at the Library of Congress, so I had a lot of access to original materials and primary sources. They relay a completely different story. They relay the story that I just gave you.
Interesting. It's crazy how, if you can actually have access to original documents, how different history unfolds when you have that context. I mean, there's a lot more that we can talk about. So I guess I would just throw it, since we're already running short on time here. What figures of the Crusades would you say are some of the ones who have been the most demonized, that you kind of want to set the record straight in the remaining time? And then what other things do you just think that every individual living in modern day America, or even abroad, should know about the Crusades?
Well, I mentioned Richard for the first question, so I won't talk too much about him. But another one that has resonance today is Saint Louis, or Louis IX, who actually was a consummate crusader, though his crusades failed. But I bring him up because in the city named after him, St. Louis, Missouri, where there's a very large statue of him, that also has been attacked, and people are trying, and the Antifa or BLM or whoever is trying to bring it down, and they have support from Muslim groups who are saying, well, he was an Islamophobe because he invaded. He actually, one of his crusades was in Egypt, and the other one was in North Africa. And again, no context, not telling you what the Muslims are doing to Christians that caused him to do that, and that's why he's actually called a saint. If you look into his life, he was very pious man, very self-sacrificing, thinking of the other. and he didn't have to. He was the wealthiest king of England, and he ended up dying in the crusade. So I mentioned him just as another one because he was in the news recently with the whole toppling down statues. And as far as the final takeaway, I guess, is just again context. Crusade. You mentioned earlier, you're a public school educated. Well, so am I. So I saw things the way you did as well. I just took it for granted, and the one thing I've learned is the more I go back to the original sources and I read things, it's almost like a guarantee I'm going to be learning the opposite of what I was told in school. It's that bad. It's hard to imagine that this isn't by design or intentional, and it's so I think anyone who's interested in the Crusade should really revisit it and try to read the older documents. If you want a simple thing, you can just go to my books because that's what my books are based on, the primary sources, and I have a lot of references in the further reading sections of the books. But I think it'll really enlighten you as to not just the Crusades, just how early Christian history is always demonized, and it's intentional and it's misplaced. And if you really look at it, for centuries, these guys, the Crusaders, they were considered heroes. They were the epitome of self-sacrificing altruism. And yet today, look how they've been morphed into what they are. Just because they're the epitome of the the evil, toxic masculinity, white patriarchy.
Right.
So they just stand for nothing that's good today. Well, it's a different story if you look into the reality of it.
Right. Yeah, and I don't know your theological background, of course, but I know for me, I have my suspicions as to why those attacks are targeted the way they are. But what do you think that it seems to be this Christian history that's demonized?
Well, no, I think there's an intentional desire to cause Western Christians to sort of renunciate their history and their heritage, which is a bad thing because they have no anchor, and that's why so many Western people just live materialistic lives with no meaning. And I think there is a real fear amongst the powers that be of the Crusader mentality. Okay, so I'll give you an example. In the Super Bowl, if you saw, they had this commercial called "Washing Feet," which I took some.
Oh yeah, the "He Gets Us" commercial.
Yeah, which is basically all these images of people washing feet, and then in the end it says Jesus didn't teach hate; he washed feet. And of course, it's very politically charged. Everyone who's washing a foot looks like a white Christian, and everyone whose foot's being washed, one's like a migrant from Mexico, one's an American Indian, one's a black trans activist or transgender, one's a woman who's committing an abortion, and you're washing her feet, and then one's a woman and a Muslim woman in hijab. So the message is very clear. The good Christian is the one who's a doormat who shuts up and just appeases, right? And I think, and that's not what the Crusaders were. They were the antithesis of that. Okay, so I think there's this real fear that we gotta, if you short of totally destroying Christianity and making it go extinct, the next best thing is to make Christians work for you by thinking their job is to basically be your doormat. So I think there's this concerted effort to convince Christians that that is what Christianity is all about. And of course, there is that portion in Christianity, but unfortunately, it's being pulled out of context once again and elevated to everything else. And that's not the Christianity of the Crusaders. That's not the Christianity of the people in the time of Christ. That's not the Christianity of most of its history. And I think people are, the powers that be want to convince us that that's true Christianity. And if you want to be a Christian, that's what you got to do. And the last thing you want to do is be these evil crusaders who stood up for something and fought back.
Right. They want to keep us passive and weak and, unwilling to actually stand up for ourselves. And that's unfortunate. Well, I really appreciate you coming on the show, Raymond. I want to give you a moment to plug your books, whichever one you think is most important for someone to read to get more context to this. Then, of course, I know it's always good to plug your most recent book. So whichever you feel is most relevant, feel free to just tell me anything about your writing and go ahead and make the pitch to our audience.
Sure. My most recent book is Defenders of the West, the Christian Heroes Who Stood Against Islam. And it's 8 chapters where I look at various heroes. One of them is Richard. One of them is Louis the Ninth. And then there's 6 others. And they're not all Crusaders. Only 3 of them are Crusaders. Some of them most people don't even know. They're from the Balkans. One is Count Dracula, Vlad the Impaler, who you really want to talk about context being pulled around and his true story, and that he was actually a good, pious Christian, and why he was demonized to this point that he's the epitome of a vampire and all that sort of thing. That's all in that book, and it really shows you not just the battles, but why Islam was doing what it was doing. So it's also educational in the sense that because it's chronological, it'll give you idea of the Islamic conquests, Islamic doctrine vis-a-vis the infidel, the Christian. So overall, probably it's gets a lot of it actually sold out recently, and they had to reprint it, and they were
Awesome.
surprised because it sold out faster than they expected. But it's available now.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, I would highly encourage the audience to pick up a copy and do some reading, and let's try to reorient our minds to actually understanding these things in their historical context. Again, we don't want to give a hall pass to any inappropriate behavior that's taken place in the name of Christ, but at the same time, we don't want to completely take it out of context and pretend that that is just the evil Christian white supremacist, always constantly picking fights out there. And it's good to have that context. Again, Raymond, I really appreciate you coming on. Where can people go to keep up with everything that you're doing?
And the best one-stop place is just my website. I have some social media, but I don't really visit it too often. But RaymondIbrahim.com, RaymondIbrahim, and all my articles and links to books and even a contact page is there.
Perfect. Well, thanks so much. And thank you, listener. We really appreciate you tuning in. Real quick, I'll just throw out this one chat that I got earlier. Dylan said that you are absolutely yoked, and he said that he is reading Defenders of the West right now. So I thought I'd give you that as a
Cool.
closing encouragement. So awesome. Well, thank you, everyone. We'll see you next time.